Hey guys, tonight we begin with a cup. Not a magical glowing chalice yet. Not a holy relic guarded by ancient knights. Not something hidden beneath a ruined chapel while monks whisper ominously in the background. Just a cup. A very famous cup eventually, of course. Because medieval Europe had an extraordinary ability to take a mildly symbolic object and slowly inflate it into a spiritual obsession involving visions, bleeding lances, mysterious castles, exhausted horses, and emotionally overwhelmed noblemen wandering through forests for 20 years. So tonight, dim the lights a little. Maybe put your phone face down. Get comfortable beneath approximately 17 blankets. And together, we'll drift slowly into the deeply strange origins of the Holy Grail legend. And as always, this is not a story about facts behaving themselves. This is a story about mythology colliding with religion, poetry, royal politics, Celtic folklore, medieval anxiety, and a truly heroic amount of emotional confusion. Because the Grail legend did not appear all at once. It slowly leaked into existence over centuries, like dampness in an old monastery wall. And honestly, that feels appropriate. The first thing to understand is that medieval people absolutely loved mysterious sacred objects. They collected relics the way modern people collect streaming subscriptions they forget to cancel. Every cathedral wanted something impressive. A saint's finger. A fragment of the true cross. A vial of holy tears. Occasionally enough pieces of the true cross to construct several medium-sized fishing boats. And naturally, somewhere in this atmosphere of competitive holiness, people became very interested in the objects associated with Jesus himself, especially the cup from the Last Supper. Now, the Bible itself does not spend much time describing this cup, which is probably sensible. The Gospels had larger priorities than antique kitchenware cataloging. But medieval imagination is not famous for restraint. Over time, Christians began wondering, what happened to the cup? Did someone keep it? Was it hidden? Did it survive? And most importantly, could possessing it perhaps make your kingdom dramatically more important than neighboring kingdoms? Because medieval rulers were always searching for divine legitimacy. If you could claim your monarchy had some direct connection to sacred history, that was excellent for public relations. And so, slowly, stories began accumulating. But the Grail legend did not emerge from Jerusalem alone.
No.
The really interesting part is that the legend appears to have grown from several completely different traditions awkwardly crashing into each other, like drunk aristocrats at a winter feast. On one side, you had Christian sacred relic traditions. On the other, ancient Celtic mythology. And somewhere in the middle sat medieval French poets, who apparently looked at all this material and thought,
Yes.
we can absolutely make this more complicated. Of course they could. The earliest real Grail story appears in the late 12th century, specifically in the work of a French poet named Chrétien de Troyes. And Chrétien was writing during a very particular moment in European history. This was the age of chivalry, or at least the age of people aggressively pretending chivalry existed consistently. Knights were becoming romanticized. Courts loved elaborate stories. Nobles wanted tales involving honor, quests, tragic beauty, and emotionally unavailable warriors staring into forests while processing spiritual confusion. Basically medieval prestige television. Chrétien wrote for aristocratic audiences, especially the court of Marie de Champagne, who was the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And if Eleanor of Aquitaine enters a historical story, things are about to become dramatically more theatrical, because Eleanor helped spread courtly culture across Europe. Her courts adored poetry, romance literature, elaborate emotional suffering, and impossible love stories involving people making terrible decisions while dressed magnificently. Into this environment came the Grail. Now here's the strange thing. In Chretien's original story, the Grail is not actually called the Holy Grail. It is simply a Grail. Lowercase energy. And even more surprisingly, it is not initially described as a cup. It's more like a serving dish or ceremonial platter, which feels much less mystical. The legendary object of Western civilization apparently began as something vaguely resembling upscale tableware. In Chretien's unfinished romance, a knight named Perceval visits a mysterious castle belonging to the Fisher King. And the Fisher King is exactly the sort of melancholy medieval figure audiences adored. He is wounded, spiritually damaged, associated with a dying land. Everything around him feels emotionally exhausted, which, to be fair, describes half of medieval literature. During a bizarre feast, Perceval witnesses a strange procession. A bleeding lance passes by. Candles glow softly. And then comes the Grail. Beautiful, golden, mysterious. But nobody explains anything. And unfortunately, Perceval has been taught that asking too many questions is rude. This becomes one of the great catastrophes in literary history. Because if Perceval had simply said, "Hey, what exactly is happening here?" the entire quest cycle might have ended immediately.
But no.
Medieval masculinity required silence, emotional repression, and wandering into forests instead of communicating directly. So Perceval says nothing. The next morning the castle vanishes. And he later learns that by failing to ask the right question, he failed to heal the Fisher King and restore the land, which is an incredibly stressful amount of responsibility for one awkward dinner conversation. But this strange episode became wildly influential. And importantly, many scholars believe the imagery came partly from older Celtic myths. Because Celtic mythology already contained magical cauldrons, sacred vessels, and mysterious feast objects associated with abundance, wisdom, or resurrection. In Welsh and Irish traditions, magical containers appeared constantly. Cauldrons that restored the dead. Vessels that provided endless food. Objects guarded in enchanted realms. The overlap is difficult to ignore, especially because medieval writers often borrowed freely from older oral traditions without carefully labeling sources, like responsible graduate students. They simply absorbed stories and reshaped them. And honestly, the medieval approach to intellectual property was basically, if I heard it in a castle once, it's mine now. So the Grail may have roots in pagan mythology long before it became Christianized, which would not be unusual at all. Medieval Christianity frequently absorbed older traditions rather than eliminating them completely. Sacred wells became Christian pilgrimage sites. Pagan festivals transformed into saints' days. Ancient myths quietly survived beneath new religious language. Europe was layered like that. Old beliefs sitting beneath newer beliefs. like archaeological strata made of anxiety and symbolism. And the Grail sits directly in that overlap. Now, naturally, once Crétin introduced the Grail, other writers immediately began expanding the concept with the enthusiasm of people discovering an unexpectedly successful cinematic universe. Suddenly, everybody had Grail theories. The object became holier, more mysterious, more explicitly Christian. Writers started connecting it directly to Jesus. One tradition claimed it was the cup used at the Last Supper. Another claimed Joseph of Arimathea used it to collect Christ's blood during the crucifixion, which certainly escalated the object's importance considerably. And then the stories became even stranger. According to later legends, Joseph carried the Grail to Britain because medieval Britain desperately wanted involvement in sacred history. This was very important politically. If Britain possessed the Grail, then Britain became spiritually significant on a cosmic level. And medieval kingdoms absolutely loved divine branding opportunities. So Joseph supposedly traveled westward, carrying the relic into ancient Britain, where hidden guardians protected it through generations. This conveniently merged Christian tradition with Arthurian mythology. And now King Arthur's court entered the picture fully, which meant the Grail story became dramatically more crowded. Because Arthurian legend is essentially an enormous medieval crossover event where every knight has unresolved emotional issues and at least 3 symbolic problems. Soon the Grail Quest became the ultimate spiritual challenge. Knights searched endlessly for it. Most failed, usually because they were too sinful, arrogant, distracted, or romantically confused, which eliminated approximately 98% of Arthurian knights immediately. One of the most important later writers was Robert de Boron, who transformed the Grail into a deeply Christian relic. His version strongly connected Joseph of Arimathea to the object and helped establish the familiar Grail mythology most people recognize today. And from there, the symbolism intensified continuously. The Grail became purity itself, divine grace, spiritual fulfillment. It represented healing, wholeness, salvation. Also occasionally extremely confusing dinner theater. Because medieval Grail stories are full of cryptic processions and emotionally devastating symbolism that nobody explains properly. Characters wander through dreamlike castles asking questions like, why does the king bleed? What does the lance mean? Why is everyone staring silently at this glowing bowl? And nobody ever answers directly. Instead, an old hermit appears 3 chapters later and explains the symbolism in exhausting detail. Very medieval. Now, perhaps the most fascinating part of all this is how the Grail reflected medieval fears and desires. The age that produced these stories was deeply unstable. Europe experienced wars, crusades, disease, dynastic conflicts, religious anxiety, and constant political fragmentation. Life was uncertain, and the Grail offered a vision of meaning hidden beneath chaos, a sacred truth waiting somewhere beyond ordinary corruption. That idea resonated powerfully, especially among aristocrats who outwardly celebrated chivalry while privately spending much of their time betraying one another over land disputes. The Grail represented moral perfection in a deeply imperfect world. which sounds beautiful,
but also exhausting.
because medieval spirituality could become incredibly intense. People fasted constantly, feared sin constantly, prepared for death constantly. Imagine living in a society where half the population believed random suffering might secretly be divine punishment for unspecified moral failures. The emotional atmosphere was not exactly relaxed. And into that world came the Grail legends, offering redemption through purity and questing. Unfortunately, many knights seeking the Grail remained catastrophically bad at self-awareness, which brings us gently toward one of the most famous Grail knights of all, Sir Galahad.
Ah, yes.
Galahad, the human equivalent of unbearably perfect homework, will drift toward him next. Because once medieval writers created Galahad, the Grail story transformed from mysterious folklore into a full spiritual performance review for every knight in Camelot. And almost all of them failed magnificently. Let's float quietly onward into that royal disaster. So now the Grail had arrived fully inside the world of Camelot, which meant the legend inherited all the emotional instability already present in Arthurian literature. And honestly, there was quite a lot. Camelot, despite modern adaptations portraying it as a glowing paradise of noble virtue, was usually held together by denial, fragile masculinity, doomed romance, prophetic anxiety, and men making catastrophic decisions because they refused to discuss their feelings openly. A very medieval workplace environment. At the center sat King Arthur, trying desperately to maintain order while nearly every knight around him wandered into symbolic disasters. And eventually, into this atmosphere of tournaments, prophecies, and emotional exhaustion, came the Grail Quest. Not a casual journey. Not a pleasant sightseeing tour through mystical Britain.
No.
The Grail Quest became the ultimate spiritual examination. A test so severe that most knights were doomed before they even saddled their horses. Which is awkward, considering knights loved quests almost as much as they loved elaborate cloaks and emotionally devastating secrets. The problem was that the Grail could not be won through strength alone. This confused many knights immediately, because medieval aristocrats had spent centuries assuming virtually every problem could be solved with swords, inheritance claims, or increasingly expensive armor. But the Grail demanded purity, humility, spiritual discipline, three qualities not commonly associated with heavily armed noblemen named things like Gawain the Fierce. And so the stories gradually divided Arthur's court into two categories: knights who looked impressive, and knights who were actually spiritually worthy. These turned out not to be the same group. Naturally, this caused problems. The great chroniclers of the Grail cycle, especially in the sprawling French Vulgate romances, transformed the quest into something almost painfully symbolic. Forests became moral landscapes. Wounds represented sin. Broken castles reflected broken souls. Everyone spoke in riddles. And every third encounter seemed to involve a monk explaining why someone's horse accident represented spiritual pride. Medieval allegory truly never believed in moderation. Now among Arthur's knights, one figure slowly emerged as the ideal Grail hero. Not Sir Lancelot, which must have annoyed him deeply, because Lancelot was supposed to be the greatest knight in the world. Handsome, brilliant, unmatched in combat. also trapped in a catastrophic romantic situation involving Arthur's wife, Guinevere, because medieval literature absolutely adored doomed emotional arrangements. Lancelot could defeat almost anyone physically. Spiritually, however, things were less impressive. The Grail stories became increasingly clear on this point. Being extremely talented while also committing adultery was apparently not ideal for mystical enlightenment. And so another knight appeared. Young,
Pure.
almost suspiciously flawless. Galahad. Now Galahad is fascinating because he feels less like a human being and more like a medieval performance evaluation created by exhausted monks. He is handsome, of course, because this is still Arthurian literature and nobody important is ever introduced as moderately damp-looking. But unlike other knights, Galahad possesses almost supernatural moral perfection. He is chaste, humble, virtuous, completely focused on divine purpose, essentially impossible to relate to. Other knights struggle with temptation. Galahad does not seem aware temptation exists. The man moves through medieval literature like a glowing cathedral window somehow mounted on horseback. And yet audiences loved him. Or at least deeply respected him, because Galahad embodied the ideal Christian knight. Not merely brave, holy, which mattered enormously during the 12th and 13th centuries, when European aristocracy was wrestling with uncomfortable questions about violence, sin, and salvation. Remember, this was the era of the Crusades. Knights were being told simultaneously that warfare was dangerous for the soul and also potentially pleasing to God under the correct circumstances. A deeply confusing message, frankly. So the Grail romances attempted to solve this tension. They imagined a knight who fought not for pride or romance or political ambition, but for spiritual truth. That knight became Galahad. And naturally, his backstory was also extremely complicated, because nothing in Arthurian legend is ever allowed to remain simple for more than 12 seconds. Galahad was usually described as the son of Lancelot, already awkward, but he was conceived through one of the strangest episodes in medieval literature. A noblewoman named Elaine of Corbenic fell in love with Lancelot. Unfortunately for her, Lancelot remained emotionally fixated on Guinevere with the determination of a man actively constructing his own tragedy. So, Elaine's family decided to intervene. And by intervene, medieval romance literature means create an ethically horrifying magical deception. Elaine was disguised as Guinevere. Lancelot slept with her unknowingly, and Galahad was conceived. Medieval storytelling occasionally glides past these details with alarming speed. Modern readers tend to stop abruptly and stare at the page for several minutes. But within the logic of the romances, Galahad's birth fulfilled prophecy. He was destined for the Grail, destined to succeed where all other knights failed. Which sounds flattering until you realize it also meant enormous pressure from birth onward. The poor man was basically assigned a cosmic group project before learning to walk. As Galahad matured, signs of his destiny appeared constantly. Swords embedded in stones, sacred seats at Camelot, mysterious visions, the universe practically screaming, "This one. We mean this one specifically." Eventually, he arrived at Arthur's court during Pentecost, the great feast day already associated with spiritual revelation. And the atmosphere became immediately dramatic. Because Arthurian courts treated prophecy the way modern corporations treat motivational branding. Everything was symbolic. Everything had destiny attached. Even furniture. Especially furniture, actually. One seat at the round table remained empty because prophecy declared that the wrong occupant would die horribly. Naturally, this seat was called the Siege Perilous, which is perhaps the most aggressively medieval chair name imaginable. Most knights avoided it.
Reasonably.
But Galahad sat there safely, proving his divine worthiness immediately. A subtle flex. And then came the Grail itself. According to many versions, the Grail appeared miraculously at Camelot during a feast. A glowing sacred presence passing through the hall. The knights witnessed divine mystery directly. And afterward, nearly all of them swore vows to seek it. This was probably a mistake, because the quest shattered the round table almost instantly. Knights scattered across Britain pursuing visions, prophecies, and symbolic suffering. Some died. Some failed spiritually. Some wandered for years in states of confused holiness. Camelot itself began quietly unraveling, which feels strangely fitting. The Grail, despite representing divine perfection, often destroys worldly institutions in these stories. Once characters glimpse absolute spiritual truth, ordinary political life starts feeling hollow. And Arthur senses this immediately. Many versions portray him as deeply melancholy when the quest begins, because he understands that his fellowship will never fully recover. His greatest knights are leaving, and not all will return. Arthurian literature loves this kind of sadness. Not explosive tragedy. Slow decline. The awareness that beautiful things are temporary. The Grail Quest carries that atmosphere constantly. Now, among the wandering knights, several figures stand out. Lancelot attempts the quest, but repeatedly fails due to his relationship with Guinevere. And honestly, his storyline becomes almost painfully introspective. Lancelot knows he is flawed. He experiences visions showing him divine truths just beyond reach. At one point, he sleeps near the Grail itself, but cannot fully approach it. The symbolism here is approximately as subtle as a cathedral falling onto a harp. He is magnificent by worldly standards, yet spiritually incomplete. And medieval audiences found this incredibly moving, because perfection was impossible. Most people, including knights, lived in compromise between ideal behavior and actual behavior. Lancelot embodied that struggle. Meanwhile, Galahad proceeds through the quest like a man who already read the teacher's answer sheet. He resists temptation, interprets visions correctly, survives spiritual tests effortlessly. Other knights encounter mysterious maidens and emotional catastrophes. Galahad simply continues glowing politely through the forest. At times, he almost stops feeling human entirely. Instead, he becomes symbolic purity in armor, which sounds peaceful, but also incredibly tiring. Imagine traveling with him. You stop for food. You complain mildly about the weather. Meanwhile, Galahad is over there achieving transcendent holiness beside a tree stump. Impossible energy. Still, medieval audiences adored this contrast between earthly imperfection and heavenly aspiration. The Grail stories weren't merely adventures. They were moral instruction wrapped inside dreamlike fantasy. Every encounter carried symbolic meaning. A broken sword represented sin. A barren wasteland represented moral decay. An injured king represented spiritual corruption spreading outward into society. The Fisher King especially became central to Grail mythology. His wound, often associated vaguely with the thighs or groin because medieval symbolism enjoyed uncomfortable ambiguity, rendered both himself and his kingdom sterile. Only the proper Grail question could heal him, which returns us again to poor Perceval and his disastrous silence. Different versions handle this differently. Sometimes Perceval succeeds eventually. Sometimes Galahad surpasses him entirely. Arthurian legend rarely worries about consistency. It behaves more like a constantly shifting collective dream. And honestly, that fluidity helped the myth survive. Writers kept adapting the Grail for new audiences. French poets emphasized courtly spirituality. German writers added philosophical depth. English authors later folded the legends into national identity. Each era reshaped the Grail according to its anxieties. Which brings us gently toward one of the most important transformations of all. Because eventually the Grail stopped being merely a medieval religious symbol. It became something bigger, a universal metaphor for impossible longing. People began searching for grails everywhere. Wisdom, immortality, perfect love, lost truth, political destiny. Human beings are remarkably talented at turning symbolic objects into emotional obsessions. And the Grail became perhaps the greatest obsession of all. But before modern romantics transformed it into mystical abstraction, the medieval stories themselves still had to collapse completely. Because Camelot was heading toward disaster. Very slowly,
Very sadly.
and with astonishing emotional inefficiency. Naturally. So next we'll drift deeper into the fall of Arthur's world, the completion of the Grail Quest, and the strange melancholy ending medieval audiences loved so much. Because the Grail could be found, but keeping the world together afterward turned out to be considerably harder. So while Galahad drifted serenely towards spiritual perfection, the rest of Arthur's kingdom was beginning to crack apart like old painted wood in a damp monastery. Quietly at first, then all at once. And this is one of the strangest features of Grail mythology. The closer characters come to divine truth, the less capable they become of functioning inside ordinary society. Camelot begins the legends as a place of glory.
Feasts.
Music, golden halls, knights performing heroic deeds with deeply impractical helmets. But after the Grail enters the story fully, everything changes. The atmosphere softens into melancholy. Characters become reflective, exhausted, haunted by prophecy. It is as though the Grail reveals that earthly kingdoms, no matter how beautiful, are temporary shadows beside eternity, which is very poetic. And also extremely discouraging for government stability. Now, medieval audiences understood this emotionally. They lived in a world where death was everywhere.
Plague. War.
Child mortality. Dynastic collapse. Nothing lasted. And so Arthurian literature became obsessed with decline. Not sudden destruction. Slow unraveling. The sadness of watching greatness fade while everyone involved makes increasingly poor emotional decisions, which, to be fair, remains a fairly timeless human activity. As the Grail Quest continues, Knights vanish into forests for months or years at a time. Some die anonymously. Some fail spiritually. Some encounter hermits who explain that their personality defects are symbolized by random birds. Medieval allegory never believed in subtlety. One knight might encounter a black river representing sin. Another might accidentally sleep beneath the wrong tree and receive a prophetic lecture from an old monk who materializes out of nowhere like a spiritually judgmental owl. And through all this wandering, Camelot itself grows emptier. Arthur becomes increasingly sorrowful. He realizes the fellowship of the Round Table, the great ideal of chivalric unity, cannot survive forever, because perfection destroys illusion. Once the Grail appears, ordinary knightly glory suddenly seems insufficient. Tournaments feel shallow. Courtly romance feels compromised. Even heroism begins looking slightly theatrical. The Grail exposes moral weakness everywhere, especially in Sir Lancelot. Poor Lancelot. One of the saddest things about medieval literature is how often it creates characters who are almost extraordinary enough to save themselves. Almost. Lancelot remains unmatched in battle. No knight equals him physically, but spiritually, he keeps colliding with the consequences of his affair with Guinevere. And the stories treat this not with explosive scandal, but with weary sadness. Because Lancelot truly loves her, and Guinevere truly loves him. Unfortunately, they also happen to be destroying Arthur's kingdom slowly from the inside. An awkward complication. During the Grail Quest, Lancelot repeatedly approaches revelation but cannot fully achieve it. He sees glimpses, visions, holy mysteries, but he remains blocked by sin. And medieval writers linger on this painfully. At one point, he is allowed to witness the Grail from a distance while physically unable to move closer. The symbolism could not possibly be clearer unless someone carried a sign reading. Adultery remains spiritually inconvenient. Still, audiences loved Lancelot because he felt human. Unlike Galahad, who occasionally resembles a decorative saint painting come to life, Lancelot struggles constantly. He fails, repents, falls again, tries to improve. In many ways, he represents the medieval Christian understanding of ordinary humanity far more realistically than Galahad ever could. People admired perfection, but they recognized themselves in failure. Now eventually, after endless wandering through symbolic forests and emotionally exhausting visions, the Grail Quest reaches its conclusion. And naturally, only a few knights succeed fully. Most versions center on three: Galahad, Perceval, and Bors, who is often overshadowed today but was considered impressively virtuous by medieval standards, which mostly meant he committed fewer catastrophic romantic errors than everyone else. Together, these knights finally approach the Grail Castle. And here the legends become intensely mystical. The atmosphere shifts away from ordinary narrative entirely. Everything glows. Angels appear. Sacred rituals unfold. Characters enter states of spiritual ecstasy described with enormous seriousness by medieval authors who absolutely wanted readers to feel overwhelmed by holiness. Galahad at last beholds the Grail directly, not merely as an object, but as divine mystery itself. The stories deliberately become difficult to explain clearly at this point. because the Grail ultimately represents something beyond language. Union with God, perfect grace, the end of earthly striving, which sounds beautiful, though also slightly exhausting after several thousand pages of wandering through emotionally symbolic weather. Now, according to many versions, Galahad dies almost immediately after achieving the Grail vision. Very peacefully, of course. He ascends spiritually. Angels carry his soul heavenward. The Grail itself often disappears from the world afterward, which is incredibly medieval. The perfect object cannot remain permanently among flawed humanity. It belongs to another realm. And so the quest ends not with triumph exactly, but transcendence. Quietly.
Sadly.
The earthly world continues, still broken. Meanwhile, Camelot remains behind, vulnerable and deteriorating. Because while the Grail quest unfolded, all the old political tensions kept worsening. And unfortunately, Arthur's court still contained several deeply unstable personalities with access to weapons. One of the most dangerous was Mordred.
Ah, yes.
Mordred. Every legendary kingdom eventually develops one deeply resentful relative capable of accelerating collapse dramatically. In some traditions, Mordred is Arthur's nephew. In others, horrifyingly, his illegitimate son. Arthurian genealogy behaves like a cursed tapestry stitched together during a thunderstorm. Either way, Mordred becomes the embodiment of Camelot's internal decay. While knights chased spiritual perfection, ordinary political disaster quietly matured in the background. And perhaps that is the point. The Grail legends constantly contrast heavenly ideals with earthly weakness. Human beings glimpse perfection briefly, but they cannot sustain it. Soon enough, Lancelot's affair with Guinevere becomes publicly exposed. Chaos follows. Arthur is forced into conflict with his greatest knight. The Round Table fractures permanently. Civil war erupts. And through all this tragedy hangs the strange memory of the Grail quest like a fading spiritual dream. Something purer than the ruined world left behind. Now the final collapse of Camelot unfolds with deep inevitability. Not excitement. Not triumph. Just exhaustion. The kingdom feels tired. The characters feel tired. Even the prophecies sound weary by this point. And honestly, this emotional atmosphere may explain why Arthurian legend endured so powerfully for centuries. It understands that civilizations rarely collapse in dramatic cinematic fashion. Usually they erode slowly through pride, betrayal, miscommunication, and emotionally disastrous leadership decisions. Very relatable, unfortunately. Eventually, Arthur marches against Mordred. The final battle approaches, and medieval writers describe it with immense sorrow. The fellowship is gone. The Grail Knights have vanished into holiness or death. The great ideals of Camelot lie shattered. Only remnants remain. Then comes the Battle of Camlan. And even here, the stories avoid triumph. Arthur kills Mordred. Mordred mortally wounds Arthur. Everyone loses. Very efficient tragedy. Afterward, the dying king is carried away toward Avalon, the mystical island associated with healing and otherworldly mystery. And again, we see older Celtic mythology beneath Christian romance. Avalon feels ancient,
Dreamlike.
a fading echo of pre-Christian sacred landscapes surviving beneath medieval storytelling. Arthur does not entirely die in many traditions. He sleeps.
He waits.
Someday he may return. Europe adored sleeping king legends. A ruler resting beneath mountains or islands until the nation needs him again. A wonderfully comforting idea, especially during unstable centuries. Now, with Camelot destroyed, the Grail effectively leaves the earthly world behind. Its brief appearance transformed everything and then vanished. And medieval audiences found this emotionally profound because the Grail was never really about possession. It was about longing. The search itself mattered more than the object. This idea became incredibly influential later. Artists, poets, mystics, and eventually modern writers transformed the Grail into a universal symbol of impossible yearning. But before we float toward those later interpretations, we should pause briefly inside the medieval imagination itself, because the people who first loved these stories inhabited an astonishingly symbolic universe. Nothing was merely itself. A forest was temptation. A wound was sin. A cup was divine mystery. Life constantly pointed beyond itself towards spiritual meaning. Modern audiences sometimes forget how deeply religious medieval Europe truly was. Not casually religious, not culturally religious, existentially religious. Heaven and hell felt immediate. Miracles seemed plausible. Saints intervened in daily life. Relics carried sacred power. Dreams contained messages. History itself appeared guided by divine purpose. And within that worldview, the Grail fit perfectly. A hidden sacred object capable of revealing ultimate truth. Of course, people became obsessed with it, especially aristocrats already drowning in guilt over warfare, luxury, and political violence. The Grail offered redemption.
Purity.
Meaning beyond earthly corruption, which sounds noble, but also created tremendous pressure to behave spiritually while simultaneously participating in medieval court politics. An impossible balancing act, frankly. And perhaps that is why the legends feel so melancholic. Nobody fully succeeds except Galahad. And Galahad barely feels human by the end. Everyone else remains trapped between aspiration and failure, between holiness and desire, between idealism and ordinary weakness, which is a very old human problem. Now, naturally, after the Middle Ages faded, people did not stop obsessing over the Grail. Not remotely. In fact, things became significantly stranger, because once later centuries rediscovered Arthurian legend, they transformed the Grail repeatedly according to their own fantasies. Romantic poets turned it mystical. Victorian writers turned it sentimental. Occult movements turned it esoteric. And eventually modern conspiracy theorists would turn it into something so bizarre that medieval monks themselves might have requested a brief lie down afterward. So next we'll drift softly into the Grail's afterlife beyond the Middle Ages, into castles filled with Victorian sadness, into opera houses overflowing with mystical suffering, into archaeologists, nationalists, secret societies, and deeply confused treasure hunters. Because somehow, against all probability, the story of one mysterious medieval serving dish was only getting started. So by the end of the Middle Ages, the Grail had already traveled a remarkable distance. From vague Celtic magical vessels to Christian relic to the spiritual centerpiece of Arthurian legend. And honestly, most stories would have stopped there. A respectable literary career. A few centuries of symbolism. Some melancholy nights wandering through forests. Perfectly adequate. But the Grail was not finished. Not even slightly. Because after medieval Europe faded away, later generations rediscovered the old legends and became completely incapable of behaving normally about them. Especially the 19th century.
Ah, yes.
The Victorians. A civilization so emotionally repressed and spiritually anxious that they looked at Arthurian legend and thought, excellent. More tragic longing, please. Now, to understand why the Grail returned so powerfully during this period, we need to drift briefly into the strange emotional atmosphere of industrial Europe. The 19th century changed everything. Factories expanded. Cities exploded in size. Railroads crossed landscapes once filled with forests and monasteries. Science advanced rapidly. Traditional religion began feeling less stable for many educated Europeans. And amid all this smoke, machinery, and social upheaval, people developed a deep nostalgia for the medieval past. Not the actual medieval past, of course. Nobody particularly missed dysentery or feudal taxation. What they missed was the fantasy of a spiritually meaningful world. A world where symbols mattered, where knights pursued ideals, where life appeared guided by destiny instead of industrial scheduling. And so medievalism became fashionable. Cathedrals were restored. Arthurian poems returned. Painters filled galleries with melancholy women standing beside lakes while armored men looked emotionally devastated nearby. Victorian art truly adored beautiful sadness. And naturally, the Grail returned triumphantly with all of this. One of the most influential figures in this revival was Alfred Tennyson. Tennyson's massive work, Idylls of the King, reimagined Arthurian legend for Victorian audiences. And the tone is exactly what you would expect. Elegant, melancholy, extremely emotionally restrained. Everyone suffers beautifully. Tennyson transformed Camelot into a reflection of Victorian moral anxiety. The Grail Quest in particular becomes deeply symbolic of spiritual aspiration colliding with earthly imperfection. And once again, poor Sir Lancelot suffers magnificently. Victorian audiences adored Lancelot because he embodied the perfect mixture of nobility and emotional catastrophe. Respectable enough to admire. Flawed enough to feel tragic. Essentially the ideal 19th century literary man. Meanwhile, Sir Galahad remained almost too pure to be emotionally comfortable. Even Victorians occasionally found him intimidating, because Galahad has the energy of a man who has never once experienced an impure thought or eaten dessert impulsively. A difficult standard. Still, the Grail itself fascinated readers more than ever. Not merely as a Christian relic now, but as a symbol of unattainable perfection. Something humanity desires endlessly, yet cannot fully possess, which fit perfectly into Romantic and Victorian aesthetics. Longing became fashionable during this era. People wandered across moors writing poetry about emotional emptiness while wearing surprisingly formal clothing. And the Grail became the ultimate object of yearning. Painters especially loved it. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, that extraordinary group of artists devoted to luminous medieval melancholy, produced endless Arthurian imagery. Flowing robes, pale faces, forests glowing mysteriously at sunset. Everyone looking slightly underfed, but spiritually significant. Artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Edward Burne-Jones treated Grail imagery almost like sacred dreaming. Their works shimmer with quiet sadness. Knights kneel beside mysterious maidens. Candles flicker in ruined chapels. The Grail hovers somewhere just beyond ordinary reach. And honestly, even modern viewers can feel the emotional pull. There is something strangely comforting about art that admits beauty and failure can coexist. Now, while British artists romanticized the Grail visually, continental Europe decided to become dramatically louder about it. Because eventually the legend attracted the attention of Richard Wagner. And when Wagner encountered mythology, subtlety quietly packed its belongings and left the building. Wagner adored grand symbolism, redemption,
Destiny.
endless suffering performed musically for several consecutive hours. And naturally, he became obsessed with Grail mythology. His opera Perceval, based loosely on the Perceval tradition, transformed the Grail story into an enormous mystical spectacle. The music is haunting,
Slow.
almost hypnotic. Perfect for a half-awake emotional crisis in a Camelot opera house. Wagner's version emphasizes spiritual purity and compassion. His hero, Perceval, succeeds not through brilliance but through empathy, which is actually rather touching beneath all the immense Germanic theatrical intensity. But Wagner also changed the Grail permanently. After Perceval, the Grail became associated not merely with medieval romance, but with mystical transcendence itself. Audiences left performances feeling spiritually overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, and probably slightly dehydrated. Exactly as Wagner intended. Now, unfortunately, 19th century Europe also had a habit of attaching nationalism to absolutely everything, including myths. Especially myths, actually. Different nations began claiming Arthurian and Grail traditions as part of their cultural inheritance. The British connected Arthur to imperial identity. The French emphasized medieval literary prestige. German thinkers attached Grail symbolism to ideas about spiritual destiny and cultural renewal, which occasionally became uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable eventually, in fact, because myths are powerful things, and people rarely resist the temptation to use ancient legends for modern political purposes. Still, before things turned darker in the 20th century, the Grail also inspired more harmless forms of obsession. Archaeologists searched for historical traces. Mystics invented elaborate symbolic interpretations. Occult groups claimed hidden knowledge. Everybody wanted secret wisdom during this period. Secret wisdom became extremely fashionable. One man claimed the Grail represented esoteric spiritual energy. Another insisted it was ancient hidden bloodline symbolism. Someone else almost certainly blamed the Knights Templar within 20 minutes. The Templars eventually become attached to every historical mystery, like spiritually overenthusiastic barnacles. And to be fair, the Templars already possess the perfect atmosphere for conspiracy mythology. Secretive warrior monks, enormous wealth, dramatic downfall,
Arrests.
executions, lost treasures. Medieval aesthetics practically custom-built for future documentaries narrated in ominous tones. So naturally, people started linking them to the Grail. There is very little historical evidence for this connection. But evidence has never been humanity's favorite ingredient when constructing elaborate mystical theories, especially theories involving hidden relics. Now, another fascinating development during this period was the gradual shift away from the Grail as specifically Christian. Modern interpretations often treated it more abstractly. The Grail became self-knowledge, artistic perfection, enlightenment, psychological wholeness. By the early 20th century, scholars like Carl Jung and mythologists such as Joseph Campbell interpreted Grail legends symbolically rather than literally. The quest became an inward journey, a search for meaning within the self, which says a great deal about modernity. Medieval people looked outward toward divine mystery. Modern people increasingly looked inward towards psychological mystery. Same longing, different direction. And honestly, the Grail adapts remarkably well to every era because it is fundamentally unfinished. Nobody fully defines it. It remains elusive by design, a symbol that changes shape depending on what people desire most desperately. For medieval knights, it was salvation. For Victorians, spiritual beauty. For modern seekers, authenticity or enlightenment. The object stays empty enough for generations to pour their anxieties into it. A very efficient legend, really. Now, meanwhile, ordinary readers and audiences simply continued loving the atmosphere of Grail stories. The quiet forests, the ruined chapels, the feeling of searching endlessly for something almost remembered but never fully grasped. That emotional tone survived even after belief systems changed. And perhaps that explains why the legend never disappeared. People still recognize longing instinctively. Even now, modern films, fantasy novels, and adventure stories constantly recycle Grail structures. A hero seeks a hidden object. The journey transforms them spiritually. The destination matters less than the search itself. Very old narrative machinery still quietly functioning beneath contemporary storytelling. Though admittedly modern heroes tend to complain more openly than medieval knights did. Now eventually, the Grail entered popular culture completely. And this is where things become wonderfully strange. Because by the 20th century, the same object that once symbolized mystical salvation would appear in pulp novels, conspiracy theories, archaeological hoaxes, fantasy epics, and eventually Hollywood adventure films involving professors running from explosions. A remarkable career evolution for a medieval serving dish. But before we drift toward modern treasure hunters and cinematic interpretations, we should pause briefly to appreciate something odd about the Grail legend itself. For all its fame, no single, official Grail story exists. Never did. The legend constantly shifted. Different writers contradicted each other freely. Some Grails are cups. Some are dishes. Some glow. Some heal. Some vanish mysteriously. Some appear alongside bleeding lances and wounded kings. Others become purely symbolic. The Grail survives precisely because it refuses to stay fixed. It behaves more like a dream than a stable narrative. And dreams adapt, especially collective cultural dreams. Which means the 20th century was about to do something extremely 20th century with the Grail. It was going to combine medieval mysticism with archaeology, nationalism, pseudoscience, adventure fiction, occult paranoia, and eventually Nazis. Because of course it was. Humanity cannot encounter a mysterious ancient relic without eventually involving Nazis somehow. So next we'll float onward into the bizarre modern afterlife of the Grail legend, into secret societies, ancient bloodline theories, questionable excavations, and one very tired chalice enduring the emotional projections of an entire civilization for another 100 years. The atmosphere there reportedly resembled a deeply uncomfortable combination of medieval reenactment society and apocalyptic cult meeting. Ritual chambers, symbolic architecture, invented traditions, everyone behaving with exhausting seriousness. Now, despite endless rumors, there is no solid evidence the Nazis ever came close to discovering an actual historical Grail relic. Mostly because no verified Grail relic exists in the first place. An awkward obstacle. Still, myths persisted. Stories spread claiming Nazi expeditions searched Europe for sacred objects. Some tales involved monasteries, others secret caves, others hidden Templar treasures guarded for centuries. And once these rumors entered popular culture, they became impossible to kill. Because humans adore stories where dangerous regimes hunt mystical artifacts. It combines history, fantasy, and paranoia in one convenient package. Very efficient storytelling. Now, after World War II, Grail mythology shifted again. The horror of the war deeply damaged older romantic ideas about nationalism and destiny. People became more skeptical of grand myths. At least temporarily. But the Grail survived because it adapted once more. This time into popular entertainment. Adventure fiction exploded during the mid-20th century. Lost relics became central to novels and films. And the Grail fit perfectly into this new atmosphere of archaeological mystery. Except now the heroes were no longer medieval knights. They were professors, explorers, treasure hunters with dusty hats and unresolved father issues. A very modern evolution. Eventually, perhaps the most famous modern Grail story arrived through Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. And honestly, this film may have shaped contemporary Grail mythology more than centuries of medieval literature combined. Suddenly, millions of people associated the Grail with hidden temples, elaborate traps, ancient riddles, and elderly knights waiting dramatically inside caves for several hundred years. Which is delightful. Historically questionable, but delightful. The film borrowed heavily from existing Grail traditions. The humble cup representing spiritual truth rather than worldly power. The unworthy seeker failing catastrophically. The test of humility. All very medieval ideas beneath the Hollywood adventure pacing. And perhaps most importantly, the film preserved the Grail's essential symbolic function. The object reveals character. Those seeking immortality or power fail. Those capable of humility succeed. An old narrative pattern still quietly functioning beneath explosions and horse chases. Now, around the same time, another bizarre Grail theory exploded into public consciousness. And this one involved bloodlines. because apparently humanity cannot encounter a mysterious symbol without eventually inventing secret genealogy theories about it. In the late 20th century, books began proposing that the Grail was never a cup at all. Instead, they claimed it symbolized the bloodline of Jesus. The word sangreal supposedly becoming sangreal or royal blood, which sounds dramatic, because it is dramatic. Historians generally remain extremely skeptical of these theories. Very skeptical. Painfully skeptical. But that did not stop the ideas spreading wildly through popular culture, especially after the publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, a work combining historical speculation, conspiracy theory, medieval symbolism, secret societies, and an impressive willingness to treat coincidence like revelation. The book claimed hidden groups preserved the descendants of Jesus through European royal bloodlines, which certainly escalated the Grail concept beyond mysterious serving dish. Eventually, these ideas inspired countless documentaries, novels, and internet theories, most famously The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. And suddenly millions of readers were convinced medieval paintings contained hidden clues leading toward explosive revelations about Christianity. Scholars everywhere developed migraines simultaneously. Now, to be fair, these modern Grail conspiracies succeeded because they tapped into something very old: the longing for hidden truth, the suspicion that official history conceals deeper mysteries. People want secret layers beneath reality, especially during uncertain times. And the Grail functions perfectly as a container for those desires because it was always elusive, always partially undefined. You can project almost anything onto it, which humanity enthusiastically continues doing. Meanwhile, actual historians spend considerable time gently explaining that medieval symbolism is complicated and not every unusual painting detail reveals an underground bloodline conspiracy. A difficult profession sometimes. Still, the Grail's survival into modernity tells us something fascinating about myth itself. Facts alone rarely sustain legends. Emotional usefulness does. The Grail persists because it satisfies psychological needs. Meaning, purpose, hope. The belief that somewhere beyond ordinary disappointment lies hidden truth capable of healing the world. That idea never really disappears, even in secular societies. Especially in secular societies, perhaps, modern life often feels fragmented,
fast,
spiritually thin. And so people continue searching for grails metaphorically everywhere. Perfect relationships, political salvation, scientific breakthroughs, self-actualization, internet productivity systems that promise emotional fulfillment through color-coded scheduling. Human beings remain seekers. The object changes. The longing survives. Now, interestingly, actual physical Holy Grails also continued appearing across Europe. Multiple churches claimed possession of the authentic cup, because naturally they did. Relic culture never truly vanished. One of the most famous candidates sits in Valencia Cathedral, the so-called Santo Cáliz, a dark stone cup with ancient origins, venerated for centuries. Some historians believe portions of it may genuinely date back to the Roman era, which is intriguing, though impossible to verify conclusively as the biblical cup itself. Other churches proposed rival relics, Europe accumulated enough alleged grails to stock a moderately mystical kitchen cabinet. And honestly, this multiplicity almost feels appropriate. The Grail was never about historical certainty. Not really. It belongs more to imagination than archaeology, more to yearning than evidence. Now, one particularly fascinating modern development involves psychology. 20th century thinkers increasingly interpreted Grail stories as symbolic journeys through the human mind. The wounded fisher king became emotional trauma. The barren kingdom represented spiritual emptiness. The Grail represented wholeness or enlightenment. The quest became personal transformation. And suddenly ancient medieval romance began sounding suspiciously like therapy with extra horses. Not entirely wrong, honestly, because myths survive by remaining psychologically flexible. Each generation discovers itself reflected inside them. Medieval Christians saw salvation. Victorians saw moral longing. Modern audiences often see identity crises with decorative symbolism attached. And perhaps that adaptability explains why the Grail never truly becomes obsolete. Even now, people instantly recognize the phrase Holy Grail as shorthand for ultimate pursuit. The Holy Grail of medicine, technology, physics,
sports.
The expression escaped mythology entirely and entered ordinary language, which is remarkable. Very few medieval symbols survive that successfully, especially symbols originating partly from mysterious Welsh cauldrons and emotionally overwhelmed French knights. Now, eventually the Grail also entered fantasy literature completely. Writers like J.R.R. Tolkien, though not directly retelling Grail legends, absorbed many of the same mythic structures. Sacred objects, spiritual quests, the corruption of power, hidden kings, lost realms fading sadly into memory. Modern fantasy inherited enormous amounts from Arthurian tradition, including its melancholy, that sense that magic always belongs partly to the past, something beautiful already slipping away. And through all these transformations, the Grail endured, changing constantly, remaining fundamentally unreachable, a symbol permanently suspended between religion, myth, psychology, and storytelling. Which means we have arrived at perhaps the strangest question of all. Why did this legend survive when so many others faded? Why this object specifically? Why did humanity cling so tightly to one mysterious medieval relic for nearly 1,000 years?
Well,
that answer lies somewhere deep inside human nature itself, and we'll drift quietly toward it next. Because beneath all the knights, relics, conspiracies, operas, and emotionally exhausted monarchs, the Grail story may ultimately reveal something surprisingly intimate about the human condition. Something ancient, something sad, and strangely comforting.